On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Never before had humanity witnessed a military invasion of such staggering scale. Thousands of tanks rolled forward like an unstoppable wave of steel. Aircraft dominated the skies, and endless columns of vehicles stretched for miles toward the east. To Adolf Hitler, this would not simply be another campaign of World War II. It would be the decisive blow that would reshape history. Within a few months, he believed, Moscow would fall. The Red Army would be annihilated, and the Soviet Union would cease to exist. But history had other plans. What appeared to be a flawless strategy slowly began to collapse. And the question that continues to fascinate historians remains the same. How did the most powerful army of its time, the force that had conquered nearly all of Europe, fail in the very campaign that was supposed to secure its ultimate victory? In this video, you will discover that the answer goes far beyond the famous Russian winter. Germany's defeat was the result of arrogance, strategic miscalculations, logistical failures, unexpected Soviet resilience, and a series of decisions that permanently changed the course of World War II. Some of those mistakes still surprise military experts to this day. By 1941, Germany appeared unstoppable. Poland had been crushed in weeks. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France, one of Europe's greatest military powers, had all fallen with astonishing speed. Across the world, governments watched in disbelief as Hitler's armies advanced almost without resistance. The secret behind those victories had a name: Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Instead of fighting long battles of attrition like those of World War I, Germany relied on speed, coordination, and surprise. Tanks smashed through enemy lines, aircraft destroyed communication centers, and motorized infantry surrounded entire armies before they even had time to organize an effective defense. The strategy seemed almost unstoppable. Millions of enemy soldiers were captured within weeks. Governments collapsed before fully understanding the scale of the German offensive. With every victory, Hitler became even more convinced that his military machine could not be defeated. That confidence led to his boldest decision. To Hitler, invading the Soviet Union was never just about conquering territory. It was an ideological war. He believed that destroying communism would give Germany fertile farmland, oil, raw materials, and the living space needed to build an empire that would dominate Europe for generations. However, there was one critical detail that experienced commanders understood, but few dared to say aloud. The Soviet Union was not France. Its territory seemed endless. Its factories could be dismantled and rebuilt thousands of miles from the front lines. Its population was enormous, and its ability to absorb devastating losses shocked even experienced military planners. There was also an unforgettable lesson from history. Decades earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had marched toward Moscow, believing victory would come quickly. Instead, he suffered one of history's greatest military disasters. Hitler ignored that warning completely. Convinced that he would repeat his previous triumphs, he launched the largest military operation ever attempted. Without realizing it, he had also begun the slow destruction of the Third Reich itself. During the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, it seemed that Hitler's confidence had been completely justified. German forces advanced at breathtaking speed. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Major cities fell one after another, and thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed before they could even leave the ground. Within only a few weeks, the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses, reinforcing the belief that Germany's victory was simply a matter of time. Yet behind this spectacular success, an invisible crisis was already taking shape. The farther the German army advanced into Soviet territory, the farther it moved away from its own supply lines. Poor roads, incompatible railway systems, and enormous distances turned fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts into increasingly scarce resources. The tanks that had become the symbol of blitzkrieg often stopped, not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they had simply run out of fuel, and that was only the beginning. Unlike the countries of Western Europe, where campaigns had lasted only weeks, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. Every time a city was captured, another defensive line appeared farther east. Every time an entire Soviet army was surrounded, fresh divisions emerged to replace it. To the German surprise, the Red Army continued fighting even after suffering defeats that would have forced most nations to surrender. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin made one of the most important strategic decisions of the entire war. Thousands of factories were dismantled piece by piece and transported beyond the Ural Mountains, safely out of reach of German bombers. Machinery, engineers, workers, and entire production lines traveled thousands of miles before being rebuilt in new industrial centers. It was one of the greatest logistical operations ever carried out during wartime. Hitler had never imagined that an entire nation's industrial base could be relocated while the war was still raging. Only months later, Soviet factories were once again producing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition in astonishing numbers. Germany had captured vast amounts of territory, but it had failed to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to manufacture weapons and replace its losses. At the same time, another costly mistake began undermining Germany's chances of victory. Instead of concentrating every available force on Moscow, Hitler repeatedly changed his objectives. At one moment, he ordered his generals to capture Kiev. Soon afterward, he redirected troops toward the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. Then he shifted his attention back to Moscow. These constant changes confused his own commanders, delayed critical operations, and wasted one resource Germany could never recover: time. Time was exactly what the Soviet Union desperately needed. Every passing week allowed new soldiers to be mobilized, fresh defensive positions to be prepared, and industrial production to increase. While Soviet strength grew, Germany continued consuming men, vehicles, and fuel in a campaign that had already lasted far longer than originally planned. The lightning war that was supposed to end within months was slowly turning into a brutal war of attrition, and that was precisely the kind of conflict the Soviet Union was prepared to win. While Hitler still believed victory was within reach, he had already stepped into a trap created by the immense size, resilience, and determination of the Soviet Union. A far greater challenge was approaching, and Germany was completely unprepared for it. When autumn arrived in 1941, German confidence was no longer what it had been at the beginning of the invasion. The advance that was supposed to end with a quick victory had slowed dramatically. The dirt roads of the Soviet Union, dry during the summer, transformed into endless seas of mud during the seasonal rains. Trucks became trapped for days, tanks moved at a crawl, and entire supply columns remained stranded before ever reaching the front lines. The Soviets knew this enemy very well, known as the Rasputitsa. This period of mud had challenged invading armies for centuries. For the Germans, however, it became an unexpected nightmare. Every kilometer gained required far more effort than military planners had predicted. The delays gave Soviet forces valuable time to establish defensive positions, rebuild damaged divisions, and prepare new counterattacks. Then came the winter. For decades, many people believed that the freezing Russian winter was the main reason Germany lost the war in the East. But that explanation, although popular, does not tell the entire story. The winter did not defeat the Wehrmacht by itself. Instead, it exposed the mistakes and weaknesses that had been accumulating since the first days of the invasion. Thousands of German soldiers were still wearing uniforms unsuitable for extreme cold. Lubricants froze, engines failed, and weapons malfunctioned in temperatures far below zero. Many horses, which were essential for transporting supplies, died from exhaustion and freezing conditions. With limited fuel reserves and supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles, maintaining the momentum of the offensive became nearly impossible. Meanwhile, The Soviet Union was doing the opposite. The factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains worked day and night. New T-34 tanks rolled out of production lines in impressive numbers. Simple, reliable, and perfectly adapted to harsh terrain, they surprised German forces with their effectiveness. At the same time, thousands of Siberian troops arrived near Moscow. Trained to fight in extreme cold, these soldiers were equipped and prepared for conditions that severely weakened the invading army. In early December, something happened that Hitler considered impossible. The Red Army launched a powerful counter-offensive around Moscow. For the first time since the invasion began, German forces were forced into a significant retreat. The image of the unstoppable Wehrmacht began to collapse before the eyes of the world. Even then, Hitler refused to accept reality. He rejected strategic withdrawals, dismissed experienced commanders who disagreed with him, and increasingly interfered directly in military decisions. Many generals believed organized retreats could save thousands of soldiers and preserve entire units for future battles. Hitler, however, demanded that no position be abandoned, turning manageable defeats into even greater disasters. At that moment, the war became more than a battle between armies. It became a struggle between flexibility and stubbornness, between military reality and political obsession. Every rigid order from Berlin weakened German forces, while the Soviets learned from their mistakes and adapted their strategies. From that point forward, Germany no longer controlled the rhythm of the war. For the first time, the Soviet Union began deciding the time, location, and conditions of the major battles, and the decisive confrontation that would determine the future of Europe was still waiting ahead. If Moscow damaged Germany's confidence, it was at Stalingrad that Hitler's dream truly began to collapse. In 1942, determined to regain the initiative, Hitler launched a new offensive toward the southern regions of the Soviet Union. His goal was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the resources that kept the Soviet war machine alive. But standing in his way was a city that carried enormous symbolic importance, Stalingrad. For Hitler, capturing that city meant humiliating Joseph Stalin in front of the entire world. The decision was no longer only military. It had become personal. Street by street, building by building, soldiers from both sides fought one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Bombings reduced the city to ruins, but those ruins actually helped the Soviet defenders, who fought from destroyed buildings and hidden positions just meters away from German troops. While Germany focused its strength inside the city, the Soviet High Command was preparing a massive trap. In November 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. Instead of attacking Germany's strongest forces directly, the Soviets struck the weaker Axis armies protecting the German flanks, mainly Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops with inferior equipment and training. Within days, the encirclement was complete. More than 200,000 German soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad, surrounded by enemy forces and cut off from essential supplies. Even when faced with disaster, Hitler refused to allow a withdrawal. He promised that the Luftwaffe would keep the trapped army supplied from the air, but the plan quickly proved impossible. German aircraft could deliver only a small fraction of the supplies needed to keep such a large force alive. Hunger, freezing temperatures, disease, and constant Soviet attacks slowly destroyed the army's ability to resist. In February 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. It was one of Nazi Germany's first major and irreversible defeats. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative permanently shifted to the Soviet Union. The Red Army launched increasingly powerful offensives, forcing German troops to retreat westward. Soviet industrial production surpassed Germany's capacity. New divisions continued arriving at the front, and military assistance from the United States and the United Kingdom strengthened Soviet capabilities even further. The war machine that once seemed unstoppable was now fighting simply to survive on multiple fronts. So why couldn't Germany defeat the Soviet Union? Because it underestimated an enemy willing to sacrifice everything to survive. Because it believed quick victories could win a war fought across an enormous territory. Because it ignored Soviet industrial strength, underestimated the Red Army's ability to adapt, and failed to recognize the limitations of its own logistics and resources. The harsh winter made the situation worse, but it was never the only reason Germany lost. In the end, no single event destroyed Hitler's plan. It was the combination of strategic mistakes, limited resources, Soviet determination, and a conflict that lasted far longer than Germany ever expected. The campaign that was supposed to secure Nazi domination of Europe became the beginning of the Third Reich's collapse and changed the course of the 20th century forever. If you enjoyed this documentary, analysis and want to discover more incredible stories about World War II and the greatest conflicts in human history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Many untold stories from the past are still waiting to be revealed.